The puma, the mountain lion, the cougar. Ever since the colonization days of the Americas, this big cat has lost habitat, prey, and has been hunted. But miraculously, while almost every other large cat in the world is facing extinction, the cougar has rebounded here in Alberta. But what's causing this sudden return? And what effects will a stagnant population jump have on the cattle industry, one of Alberta's most important resources? Today, we uncover these mysteries. This is the rise of the cougar. The Rocky Mountains. Quiet, save for the faint chirping of a bird. It's peaceful. Most of the animals in Alberta's wilder regions live freely during the day. But come nightfall, a ghost haunts these woods. The cougar. Cougars are the fourth largest cat in the world, and males can weigh over 200 pounds. That doesn't seem very large compared to other big cats like the lion or tiger, but what this cat lacks in size, it makes up for in ferocity, bringing down prey like deer and even elk, which can be more than 3 times its size. Cougars in Alberta were reaching numbers as low as 600 12 years ago, but since then have nearly tripled, being more than 2,000. Tyler McLaren is the program director at WildSmart, which aims to reduce negative human-wildlife interactions.
Well, at any time in this food web, in this chain that we have, when you start adding to particular population numbers, it could be an indication of things happening lower down in that chain. So for cougars, it may mean that they now have availability of more spaces. There may be more animals out there that they're able to see as prey species. They may be animals that they haven't traditionally used as prey species before. It may be things like hare that might be more abundant in one place than deer, for example, and cougars could really zero in on that. I think one of the big things that may contribute to the expansion of these population numbers is the fact that we've really stopped a lot of our efforts to reduce population numbers for these big animals. For a long time in North America, we really saw animals, particularly predators, wolves and cougars, as a nuisance and did our best to reduce their numbers through active hunting, even through different government programs to try to reward hunting in some places. Now, since we've stopped doing that, we're starting to see a resurgence of some of these animals into areas that they traditionally or historically did occupy. So you can imagine that as the European settlers are settling in North America, they're moving westward across the continent and pushing those big animals into more isolated areas, like here in the mountains, for example. Once we stop actively pushing, those animals are then free to come back out into those areas where they historically would have been. So in the province of Alberta, where estimated populations are rising, more so in the north of Alberta, moving eastward out of the Rocky Mountains, it seems right in line with that sort of hypothesis.
Tyler believes that cougars are an important part of the ecosystem, and the fact that humans can coexist with them so closely with so few attacks is impressive.
I think that rise in the population numbers of predators might unnerve a lot of people, but I don't think that it necessarily has to be a cause for concern. I think that we should use it as an impetus to prepare ourselves on properly avoiding and handling encounters with these animals. We know they're out there. We know we're going out there to recreate in the same spaces, and we know that there are some very effective ways to mitigate the risks to us and them. So cougars in particular, as with most of the big carnivorous animals, they really need space. They need space to be able to thrive. Out here in the mountains, where there wasn't a lot of encroachment by humans for things like development, they were allowed to continue having that space. And when we stopped that active push, it meant they were able to reclaim some other spaces that may have already been rich of the other resources they need to make homes and to find food on those landscapes. Probably one of the biggest things that is a threat to cougars is humans, and humans on a number of different aspects. I'm talking encroachment from human infrastructure, roads and trails that gives people easier access to traditional habitats for cougars. Also, humans themselves. This idea that I talked about of people being afraid can create a real negative relationship between us and these animals. And we're really trying to work on that relationship to make sure that people understand what the actual risks are, how easy they are to mitigate sometimes, and how that can lead to coexistence on a larger scale. But in the large scheme of things, humans tend to be, can pose a real threat to any number of animals when we encroach without thinking about our ramifications for others.
But as important as the conservation of these animals is, cougars are still predators. But cattle might not be the #1 thing on the menu. While the number of cougars has increased, Fred Hayes, policy analyst for Alberta beef producers, isn't too concerned as he believes cattle are not the cat's primary target.
And in terms of problems with livestock, more of a problem with sheep than with cattle. You'd think that they would be a problem perhaps with calves and smaller cattle, but basically not that much. Our estimations for total predation losses for cattle from all sides are about $1.5 million. But for cougar, coming out of that, for cattle, the cattle side, I would say it would be under $10,000 in a year. And the primary animals that cougar go after are deer and moose. So cattle and livestock are really, particularly cattle, are not necessarily a problem or an issue for us with cougar.
About a 20-minute drive past Cochrane is the acreage of Eric Butters. Eric has been ranching cattle out here for more than 50 years and has had rare confrontations with cougars.
Well, we have had an incident or two, but they're very rare. And the only times that I know of have been baby calves. And if the calf just disappears, I think the cougars take them home with them. Unlike wolves or bears or coyotes, which will largely eat them on the spot, and there's always some remains. But on the rare occasion we've had cougars, there's usually nothing left to find. They just disappear. Yeah, if you talk to people who live in the foothills like this, everybody's got a story or two. You know, here my house is kind of on the edge of the trees, which is somewhat risky. They like cover. They don't want to have to go 100 yards in the open very often.
Calves, like this one born 8 hours prior, learn to walk very quickly, which along with the protection of the herd, puts them at less risk than wild herbivores like deer. Their young age and size still can make an easy meal for a big cat, given the opportunity.
Well, there's really not much you can do. I mean, the cougars are extremely nocturnal. I know there's all kinds of them around, but I've only, I think, seen 5 or 6 in my lifetime that I've actually seen, because they're very shy and they're very nocturnal. So in terms of precautions with the cattle, I mean, the cows with baby calves tend to be in a bunch, so they're sort of, I guess, naturally trying to protect them from their calves from cougars or any other predator around. But the last few years, when they become so plentiful, we've got a little more in tune to actually protecting people. Although it's very rare for cougars to attack people, it does happen. And so now I tend to carry bear spray if I'm back in the bush, and I encourage other family members to do the same thing. We try and live and let live with wildlife here all the time. Of course, I get real cranky if they start bothering my cattle, but it's happened very rarely. So it's, I don't mind. I know there's, I shouldn't say I know there's a lot of cats around. I am absolutely convinced that there's a lot of cats around because of the tracks and the cougar hunters that come in the fall and early winter see tracks all the time. People here in the nearby acreages are seeing cougars all the time because the deer seem to go in there trying to get away from the cats, so the cats wind up going in there looking for the deer. So there's all kinds of them around, and as long as they sort of leave me alone, I'm happy to leave them alone.
Taking away from both Eric's lifetime of experience near these animals and Fred's assurance that cougars aren't the biggest problem for cattle, Alberta beef will most likely endure the rise of the cougar. And while the cougar population is ever increasing, it is important not to take it for granted and to keep preservation in mind.
I think that we all have a role to play in preservation of cougars, of grizzly bears, of natural spaces in our province. And one of the biggest things that I try to preach is that people take personal action. Do something yourself. A lot of the time we look to governments or other outside agencies to provide us all of the answers or the best quick fix solutions. And there aren't always those sorts of quick fix solutions. But if every single person did one thing for these animals, from picking up a piece of garbage on the trail, to making noise to let them know you're coming so you're not surprising them, to keeping your pet on leash so that it's not out just wantonly harassing wildlife if given the chance. All of these things are personal responsibility choices that can have huge impacts for the positive relationship between humans and wildlife.